Buenas noches y bienvenidos a esta conferencia.
Good afternoon and welcome to this conference in Casa Árabe, the challenges in the transition in the Arab regimes, with our guest Yazid Sayigh. Observers of the situation in the Middle East foresaw times of changes in 2011 and the end of 2010, with the popular uprisings and the resignation of presidents like Hosni Mubarak or other dictators of the area. The direction that had been undertaken was heading towards democracy and greater political participation and social justice. However, several years before the Iraqi experience, the change of regime involved a dissolution of the institutions and the strengthening of corrupt practices and the gathering of power within the hands of the elite that may have not been on the side of Saddam Hussein, but those who would develop into the Shiite political groups after the change of regime. Those times in Iraq were not very promising for the region in terms of democracy. The handling of the transition from dictatorship to democracy is a complicated issue, and we find proof of these in Argentina, Brazil, or Chile. However, in Spain, Portugal, and in the ancient Yugoslavia have also demonstrated that this is not an easy step. Sometimes this has meant the collapse of the state, and in other occasions the countries have reproduced the authoritarian power. A lack of power in some cases has led to a very violent penetration of non-state parties into the government. What has defined the path in each of cases have been, could the end of the rentier model provide a useful framework to understand the crisis of many Arab states and their future, the options for the future? These are some of the questions that our speaker tonight will try to answer today. A rentier state is the term that we use for those countries that are non-democratic and that ensure a minimal well-being for the population thanks to the income derived from non-productive economic activities such as oil extraction. According to certain political and economic experts, these limit the public liberties and freedom, and they prevent the uprising of groups that are against the regime. The origin of the term is linked to the consolidation in the 1960s and 70s of military dictatorships in Arab countries in the Persian Gulf and the Maghreb area. There could be a better distribution of the wealth and a higher satisfaction among the population without opposition to the government in these type of states. So this is the end of my presentation. Let me introduce Yazid Sayigh. He's a researcher, associated researcher in Carnegie Middle East in Beirut. He has worked in the transformation of the sector, in the security in the Arab transition, reinvention of authoritarianism, and the conflict between Israel and Palestine and the peace process. He was also professor of Middle East Studies in King's College in London, and between 1994 and 2003, he was director assistant in the Center of International Studies in Cambridge, and from 1998 to 2003, he directed the Middle East program of the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. He was also a counselor and negotiator of the Palestinian delegation in the peace talks with Israel from 1991 to 1994. We are very happy to have him here tonight to hear his assessment about the future of the Arab countries and their respective transitions. Good afternoon, and please, the floor is yours, Mr. Sayed.
Upper, lower limits? Yeah, 30 to 40. Okay. Well, thanks for that warm introduction, and thanks for the invitation to Casa Arabia. I've been associated, I think I'm on the board somewhere, or I used to be, but I've never actually been able to visit the Institute, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be in Madrid, of course. This is very much a work in progress. These are ideas I've been struggling with, to be honest, right up to the last minute, in terms of how to encompass something as broad as authoritarian systems in the entire Arab region over a trajectory of time, covering several decades, in order to identify where we are today. Because I feel we're in the middle of, maybe not even in the middle, the first stages of a period of historic change in which political, social, economic, administrative, legal systems through which Arab states have governed themselves for at least the last 40 years or so, 45 years, since the 1970s, in which these structures are in crisis, in some cases responding effectively, in quite a few others failing to respond effectively, and therefore moving from crisis into breakdown. And it seems to me that this is a long historical process. It's the result of accumulated changes and pressures and dynamics that are now finally starting to unfold, or have been at least for, since the Arab Spring, but in fact I think since at least 2003, with the US invasion of Iraq, with the withdrawal of Syria from Lebanon, with a number of different things that in a sense were part of one single broad sweep of crisis. What I want to do now is focus, however, on one angle of this. I've got a bit of asthma, so you'll have to forgive me. It's all the travel. If I have to cough every now and then. Since early on in 2011, with the Arab Spring, I was convinced that the pretty phase, the beautiful phase was over, the easy phase was over, and now the hard phase would start, because I couldn't believe that systems of authoritarian power that had built themselves over decades of time and that had reshaped entire societies, how business was done, how the private sector operated, how people thought, culture, education, everything had been reshaped in these countries around these authoritarian systems. And I was convinced that what had happened between December 2010, the first spark in Tunisia, and then the big revolutions of January in Tunisia and Egypt, and of course what followed next elsewhere, that this was insufficient to transform these societies or these political systems, and that the old regime was still there, the old social order was still there, and would fight back. And I expected dirty wars, assassinations, bombings. I couldn't predict things like the Syrian civil war or total breakdown in Libya and Yemen, but I knew that the old order was not yet gone. And since then I've been interested to look at how authoritarianism would reconstitute itself, would reproduce itself, or reinvent itself. And so what I'm going to look at today is just a few cases where I think we can see this. We can see what this looks like. Egypt is an obvious one, the most obvious in some ways. But Iraq also, although it's been given a democratic structure, democratic constitution since 2003, nonetheless, there are strong elements of the revival of authoritarianism within this democratic framework. And Syria, which of course hasn't finished its transition at all. We don't yet have a post-war or post-conflict new political order, but where I think we can also predict quite safely the kind of authoritarianism that is likely to emerge in these three cases, but also in others that may have preceded Algeria, for instance, that went through its dark decade of the 1990s and has reconstituted many parts of the old FLN system prior to 1990, You could argue that there are other authoritarian states in the region, certainly, varying degrees of authoritarianism from Jordan or Morocco, which are very sort of liberal authoritarianism, to other parts of the Gulf, certainly Libya and Yemen, which may yet emerge into new kinds of authoritarian, or maybe in the case of Yemen at least, something somewhat more consociational, i.e. where there's more of an agreed pact, a pacted democracy, if you like, or semi-democracy. So I'm going to focus on just these three countries, which I look at a lot, and where I think we've got a fair amount of evidence, and where we also have a lot of historical knowledge. We know what these countries have done in the last 40 years or so we can better understand what's happening now, because what's happening now is not divorced from the past legacy or the past trajectory. So what I want to argue in particular, this is my sense, if you like, from, I see you've got my most recent paper on security sector reform. I look at the police a lot. I look at armed forces. I look at non-state armed actors. I look at conflict. I look at war as a social process, a process of transformation, for good and for bad, which has changed all societies on earth. I mean, you think about this country changed in World War I, but especially, of course, the Civil War and then World War II. There's no society that has not been reshaped and rebuilt by war. We're looking at a particular case here. But what I want to say about these countries, having looked at some of the pillars of power, in this case, the coercive agencies of state, the police, intelligence, and the armed forces, it's my view that these systems that have re-emerged are fragile, or I prefer the word in English, brittle. It's like what bones become when you get very old and you get osteoporosis. Basically they break very easily. They're not just fragile, but they're too hard to have any resilience. There's no flexibility left. These are systems, in other words, that have lost the reserve of flexibility which the previous authoritarian systems had. And this is what I want to try and demonstrate. So, in order to explore this, I'm going to look at three dimensions of authoritarian power. I mean, these are three dimensions of any power, but I want to look at how they operated in authoritarian contexts. One is the political system or arena. Is there a political arena of some sort, a formal political arena, a legal political arena, in which politics is conducted? This could be parliament. Hosni Mubarak in Egypt had a parliament. The parliament was brought in by Anwar Sadat back in the 1970s. So there was an arena. It was controlled, it was used for the circulation of the elite, but there was a formal arena. And it allowed informal politics, to the extent that, say, the Muslim Brotherhood were able to run in the parliamentary elections of 2005 and take about 20% of the seats without using their name. That was a sort of political flexibility, if you like, that Hosni Mubarak, running an authoritarian system in which he relied very heavily on his security services, nonetheless, there was that margin. Today's Egyptian regime does not have any political arena. None at all. There's a parliament, but I think it'd be very hard put to persuade me or anyone that that represents a political arena, and we could go into that later if you like. In any case, these regimes, I'm focusing here on these three, but I think it's true of others that may go this way, that post-crisis, post-war, post-transition, depending on the case, these new authoritarian regimes, or people who would like to construct authoritarianism, let's say Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq, who operated within a democratic structure but ran things in a highly authoritarian way, and is partly why Iraq is where it is today. These regimes have been less willing, but also less able than their predecessors to accommodate any form of political dissent. Not just open opposition, but dissent, disagreement. People who just sit in a cafe and want to be able to say that they disagree. So already the idea that there's any form of inclusive politics is lost. And of course, with the current polarization, civil war in Syria, several wars in Iraq, you could say, and total polarization in Egypt, there is no longer room for inclusion of any kind. And as I'll discuss later, that is not only regarding the political arena, it also relates to the social arena. Capital, and here I mean financial capital, money, shared among these three regimes and others is the deep problem they now face, an exceptional difficulty in generating capital, whether this comes from oil sales, sorry, you can get rid of that, just put it there. If that comes from trade, from mining, from other productive parts of the economy, or from external sources, borrowing, the IMF, from the Gulf, from strategic rent, as it used to be called, i.e. by being a useful ally in the Cold War, Egypt or Syria could get cheap military hardware or economic assistance and so on from one of the superpowers. Now these regimes find it extremely difficult to generate capital, which they need for defense, for repression, for development, for investment, or to buy social goodwill from different social constituencies by giving them rewards, by directing investment, agricultural credit to farming communities, cheap food to urban communities, etc. And moreover, these regimes happen to have difficulty generating capital at a moment when they no longer have big reserves that they can draw on. Iraq, after all, is an oil-wealthy country, hugely wealthy. But going way back already to the 1980s, due to the Iran war and then, of course, the Kuwait invasion, the entire reserve capital of Iraq was lost, and it became mortgaged for decades to come. So these regimes not only can't generate the capital, they don't have obvious reserves, hidden bank accounts somewhere that they can draw on. So there's this double crisis. Third is the issue of the social contract. These regimes, and by social contract I mean social pact, social compact, many different terms, which are the sort of understanding between the state or those who rule the state and society, the sort of set of ideas about duties or rights and obligations. And broadly in authoritarian systems in Arab countries, this has meant you don't get political freedoms, but you get subsidized commodities, subsidized services. You get some basic protection and security. You know, we deal with violent crime, we deal with certain threats. And it's noticeable that in most Arab states, although the statistics are highly problematic in many of them, broadly speaking, until about a decade ago, crime rates, and especially violent crime, were pretty low, in fact, some of the lowest globally, which is a bit of a paradox, but the point is there was a sort of social contract. And today, the social contract is broken, and it is no longer recognized. When people in the wealthiest of these three, Iraq, demonstrated a year ago, because they still don't get electricity, 12 years after the US invasion, and despite the spending of $500 billion of public money, Iraq, since 2003, in the first 10 years, built exactly 0 hospitals, 0 electricity plants. Where did the 500 billion go? So you can understand why people in Iraq, even in the poorest parts, in the Shia parts of Iraq, which are seen as having won the war, finally demonstrated, just the way people in Lebanon demonstrated in the same summer, in the same month, against the garbage crisis that you would have heard about. So these regimes are unable to restore the social contract and to rebuild it, partly because, of course, of the problem of capital. So they can't anchor, they can't base their political control, or what we call social control, on the social contract anymore. The social contract is gone. And this has various consequences I'll come back to, but interestingly, it also appears that these regimes are actually less interested in rebuilding the old social contracts. They're looking for new kinds of social arrangements. So I'm going to touch here and there as I go along on some of the counter cases to look at Arab states which have managed this transition better and which are managing, if you like, to maintain their politics, broadly authoritarian, but maybe soft authoritarian, as in Morocco or Jordan, for instance. But it is noticeable that there are a number of countries where a crisis could have happened. Algeria is another example for that matter. It's not a monarchy like the others, but in a way they had their crisis early enough so that now they're in a better position to deal with the current situation. For good or for bad, I'm not taking sides here. But I'm going to go into some detail now, but also use the contrast now and then to emphasize the points I'm making. So clearly, and this will become evident as I go along, the ability of each of these countries to deal or fail to deal with the transition and with the rebuilding of authoritarianism has a lot to do with their previous trajectory. What happened with them in the last 10 or 20, 30 or 40 years has a lot to do with their ability or their lack of ability and resources today. So there's a necessary connection between the two. The timing is also extremely important. As I just said about Algeria, in a way, because they had their existential crisis in 1988 to 1992, which then led to civil war, they were able to deal with it at that time in a way that maybe they couldn't have dealt with it today with low oil prices. Prices were also low in by the end of the 1980s, but with the end of the Cold War and various other factors, they'd already anticipated by starting to liberalize the economy and to liberalize politics in a way to take away the pain of austerity, of economic austerity. And they still faced a war, and finally, of course, the system won, and from 2000 onwards, Algeria was on a new path of stability, good or bad. So the timing was critically important. For Egypt, for Syria, for Iraq, their timing is poor for various reasons I'll go into later. The second thing, so that was the second thing, so wider external developments, what's happening in the region, what's happening in the international arena is very important also in determining the choices, the options, the resources available to these regimes or the constraints on them. Now, I have quite a lot of detail. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I wouldn't be able to do that in the time I have. But I wanted to lay out that framework because I think that's the core. This is what I want to test. So, looking at politics first. And when I talk about the politics, I'm talking about these systems might be highly formal and institutionalized. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, for instance, had one ruling party which was highly disciplined, small in membership, unlike, say, the Ba'ath Party of Syria, which was the exact opposite. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had highly efficient state institutions, very low levels of corruption, again, the exact opposite of Syria. So they're not exactly alike in these ways. But in both there were, so what I'm talking about by politics here is structure, how politics were formally structured, how they were informally conducted, Saddam Hussein operating through a highly formalized structure based on key levers of state agencies, intelligence agencies, the Ba'ath Party, the Syrian regime relying on those same levers, but actually running them not through the formal process in reality, but through networks, which permeated or penetrated all these structures, the government, the ministries, the Ba'ath Party itself, the army. They were all penetrated by networks, which were how the regime really operated and still operates in Syria. This is partly why the Syrian regime has survived so far in this war, because the formal structures were never how it ran the country. It always ran the country through the informal networks, and this is how it still holds Syria together, or it's part of Syria. So what happened with Iraq after 1990 is particularly interesting in that there was no attempt at political liberalization or limited liberalization, which Hosni Mubarak did in Egypt from 1995, as I described earlier. That didn't happen in Iraq. But during the international sanctions from 1990 to 2003, what Saddam Hussein's regime did was something different. They devolved or sort of delegated key state functions to social actors. So the leaders of Arab Sunni clans, for instance, were given huge authority of discipline over their own clans. So they once more became leading patriarchs with full authority over the men and women of their clan in return for loyalty to the regime. They were also encouraged to run the smuggling networks through which the Saddam Hussein regime brought in a lot of income during the sanctions by smuggling across the borders into Syria and Iran in particular. These clans were part of that whole network and were given the sort of the license to run their own economy. Even the Shia, who were supposedly, suppressed under and were oppressed under the Ba'ath regime, people like Al-Khou'i, the Khou'i Foundation, and Muqtada al-Sadr's father, who Muqtada al-Sadr is now a leading Iraqi politician, cleric. His father had a network of charitable associations which, under sanctions, were allowed to take on an open role in providing social services and help to Shia communities in Iraq. So Saddam Hussein was already giving away a lot of key powers, in a way, ultimately still holding certain powers in his hands. That was one trajectory, but what it did was already state institutions in Iraq had been hollowed out. They had become fragile, like the bones I mentioned earlier. So by the time the US invasion comes, and then a new democratic system is being built, the state no longer had its integrity or cohesion. The culture of corruption, if you like, and service efficiency, which was brutal and authoritarian, but that too was lost. And instead we have a democratic system, but a democratic system operating in a context of highly polarized political competition that produced massive corruption. I've, of course, mentioned Egypt already, so I'll jump with Egypt to what's happened since 2011 to point out that, as I said earlier, the regime that emerged in two main stages, or three if you like, since 2011, 2012 with the Morsi administration, the Muslim Brotherhood, and finally the military takeover of July 2013 and the attempt to build a new order. This order today is, I think, in crisis because it is not simply totally intolerant of dissent, but each of the key state institutions that formed the ruling coalition of Egypt today, the armed forces, the Ministry of Interior, the judges, and a few others. In my view, these people run the country as a coalition. Each of them, however, is autonomous from the other. Each, in other words, is not accountable to a higher authority, the Constitution, the Supreme Court, the President. There's balances, and Sisi has to give each of these key institutions rewards, contracts, autonomy to function in their own area. And I can go into detail on this because I've been studying this at great length. The point I want to make, however, is this is Egypt, the oldest state on earth, which in a way doesn't have a state today. The state as an overarching structure that is higher than everyone. That doesn't exist today in Egypt. And what that means also is that Egypt, I think, is brittle, it's fragile, in a way that, first of all, I think it's going into a social meltdown. But on the issue of politics, if at some point the armed forces decide that we don't want to be in the middle of running Egypt, we don't want to govern directly or indirectly, we can't do this. We want to hand over. as happened in Brazil in 1974 with the Abertura. There, the army turned to the business class and to political parties that still existed and worked out a deal. And it took 10 years to implement. Who does Sisi or who do the armed forces in Egypt make a deal with? They have no social allies. Big business is not a key part of the new regime. Big business itself is divided. Who else is there? There are no political parties that have the slightest power or credibility in Egypt, and not even the Muslim Brotherhood anymore. So who would the armed forces hand over power to, even if they wanted to? That, to me, is a regime that is politically hugely at risk. I'll say a word about the Assad regime, also simply focusing on the today. And this builds on an argument I made about a month ago in an op-ed I published, where even if the Assad regime wins the war militarily or secures a political deal in which the Americans, the Saudis, the Turks, everyone accept that Bashar al-Assad is there as president in a transitional period and has the right to run afterwards in new elections. In other words, to secure himself for the foreseeable future. Even then, this is a regime that can't rebuild the old order because its reliance on networks, which has helped it survive the war, hinged on, depended on control of an economy, control of access to markets, to credit, to contracts. This is how the crony businessmen made their money. This is how farmers got agricultural credit. This is how warlords or security services or local Ba'ath Party members or provincial governors were allowed to get into lucrative markets like mobile telephones or black market activities. But these are no longer available to the regime. So what does it offer the networks in peace? In war, it can go on offering them the war economy and the threat of death because ISIS or someone will kill you. But when there is peace under the new Assad regime, where's its capital? What means and resources does it have to rebuild the old networks or to demand that the networks hand power back to the center and then go back to running the Ba'ath Party and the ministries and the economy? They don't have that. Which takes me again into the issue of capital. I'm skipping comparison here with some other countries. I can come back to this later on. Capital, it's obvious with the case of Iraq, I mentioned this already, that since the 1980s, Iraq ran out of capital. The Iran-Iraq war cost it at least $250 billion. And there's lost economic opportunity, there was direct war damages, and then there was war debt and reparations to Kuwait and other countries. Iraq was still paying most of this off after 2003. And I'm not even sure that they finished paying off most of this. So Iraq's entire reserves for generations to come were already mortgaged, let alone the previous investment. The sanctions of 13 years devastated infrastructure. As I mentioned with the case of electricity and with almost every other aspect of infrastructure and public services, Iraq has still not rebuilt to where it was even under sanctions. Saddam Hussein could rebuild infrastructure quicker. In 1991, when he crushed the rebellion of the South and the North, he rebuilt the entire electricity system in the entire country, except for the Kurdish areas that he didn't control, within 6 months. Here, it's 13 years later, and Iraq still doesn't have 24/7 electricity. So, and today, of course, with the sharp drop of oil prices and with no prospect of them rising to anywhere like $90 or $100 a barrel for at least the next 2 years, if not longer, Iraq no longer has the capacity to generate capital. It has failed to transform its economy despite repeatedly promising to do so to Western governments, the IMF and others. Syria clearly, as I've already said, lacks the obvious sources of capital. It already was running out of capital during the last decade before the war, as the regime introduced neoliberal economics, but in a crony or predatory way, which allowed key individuals close to the ruling family to benefit enormously, or people who were members of the security services, the Ba'ath Party, and so on, to take over both the black market as well as the formal market that was being liberalized. So ironically, even people operating in the black market found that they were being squeezed out. And this all occurred at a time, moreover, of drought in the East, which drove 1 million people from the East to the cities of the West between 2003 and 2006, a time of rising global food prices, 2008 and again 2010. So the regime's social contract, which I'm going to come to in a moment again, of offering farming communities, heavily, Sunni farmers of Syria who until 2006 or 7 or even 8 were still loyal to the regime because they were primary beneficiaries of 40 years of Ba'athist agrarian policies. By 2010, the crisis of capital meant that none of this was operating anymore. And at the same time, there were new competitors competing from a position of power and strength for capital in the new semi-neoliberal system. So, and with Egypt, here's something very interesting, that from about 2002, with the new wave of privatization of the Egyptian economy, there was a lot of excitement about how Egypt was achieving very impressive growth rates. And the GDP economy, the overall economy, grew massively. And of course, most, World Bank, IMF, most of us tend to look at the GDP, per capita GDP, the big macroeconomic figures for the economy. And if it looks good, then it's good. But in reality, almost all the growth in that decade, the last decade of Mubarak's rule, came from real estate, speculation in land and construction, and from energy. In other words, as Karim mentioned earlier, a rentier type growth, not from increasing productivity in manufacturing, agriculture, or services. In fact, productivity in these sectors in Egypt dropped in that decade. So this was an economy that was actually getting worse off in that decade, not better off, even before the transition. So what I'm saying is that Egypt's chronic problems since Nasser's days in the 1950s and through ever since, deep structural problems of poverty and unemployment, definitely, illiteracy, I'll come back to some of the details later if you like, low, medium skills, in some cases very good skills and very good medium skills in parts of the population, and then extremely poor skills for a very large part of the population, poor education levels for that large part of the population, low productivity overall, and low investment, domestic and foreign, except for real estate and energy. These are massive problems for any country. A country that has become tied into the global economy, to World Bank thinking, and so on, and which is being asked to provide its own hard currency, to export to get hard currency, to be competitive, and so on. How on earth are they going to do this? They've failed to resolve these challenges for 60 years. And right now, Sisi is coming no closer. And this regime today is as dependent as any of its predecessors on capital inflows coming purely for political purposes, i.e. political rent. The regime, whatever you want to call it, the government, since 2013, in the first 2 years or so, received $25 billion of assistance just from the GCC countries. Cash or support for the Egyptian pound or budgetary assistance put into huge job-generating schemes like building roads, building social housing, and so on. May be good. My point is, the $25 billion failed to change the low state of foreign currency reserves, or improve the balance of payments, or improve the balance of trade. Today, Egypt is actually worse off in terms of exports versus imports than ever before. And it's now just negotiated a $12 billion deal with the IMF, one of the largest the IMF has ever given, if not the largest. And the prospect is that the $12 billion will, they won't disappear necessarily into people's pockets, but the impact on this economy will be invisible within 6 months, if not less. The country has already absorbed massive amounts of investment since its donor conference of Sharm el-Sheikh at the start of last year, and we're talking about something on the order of possibly 80 and maybe more $billion in the past 3 years of investment, budgetary assistance, cheap petroleum, and so on. And yet, the country right now is worse off than it was in 2012. So what does this do for the social contract? Well, first of all, it seems impossible to rebuild any kind of social contract without capital. So I could just stop right there and not say anything more. In all three states, previous authoritarian regimes directed significant amounts of capital into, as I mentioned with Syria, into, say, agriculture or into farmers, the farming class, partly because it was an important social and therefore political constituency. And we see that the stability of the Assad regime from 1970 onwards had a lot to do with the investment made. Certainly policies started before Assad, but the policies of Hafez al-Assad in investing major resources right through to about 10 years ago under Bashar al-Assad into agriculture. Cooperatives, fertilizer, credit, seed, technical expertise, agricultural technical colleges, a lot happened, the building of dams and so on. In Egypt or Iraq as well, all these regimes focused on their urban populations, making sure that food could be supplied at affordable prices for working class sectors, urban sectors, food and services, but also for middle classes, which in most of these countries remained heavily dependent on direct or indirect employment or funding from the state. Public sector universities, public sector hospitals, public sector schools. We're talking in any of these countries, Egypt, for instance, has anywhere between 6 and 8 million people on the public payroll. This is not counting other forms of indirect financing. So these proportions are the same in Iraq or in Syria. So funding was going into buying social goodwill, compliance with government policy. Of course, it was mediated through many intermediary agencies. The leader up there says, I want this. Government issues a policy. What happens on the ground is something different. It's the same in Spain, it's the same in France, it's the same in any country in the world. Government policy looks like this, and then it gets operated through ministers, civil servants, provincial governments, municipal governments, power brokers, neighborhood level, contractors, subcontractors, sub-subcontractors, everywhere in the world, whether it's Chinese communist China or democratic Britain or Sisi's Egypt. Now, exactly how that works out, what the transaction costs are, how much is lost on the way, and what sort of power do the Umda in Egypt, the mayor in an Egyptian village, or a Ba'athist governor in Daraa province, or a warlord in Iraq, how they operate, how they translate their official power into either personal gain or into social wheeling dealings. Ultimately, these people maintained social peace. They kept the order. They were part of the system that kept stability under Hosni Mubarak or Hafez and Bashar al-Assad or even under Saddam Hussein and everyone who came after. And in many cases, even after the transition, this lower structure, especially outside the big cities, in the provinces, hardly changed. Sorry. So if you're to go to villages in Egypt, or probably villages in Syria, you'd see the same people still running the show at the local level. And it didn't matter if it was Sisi in power, Mohammed Morsi in power, Hosni Mubarak in power. It was always going to be the same faces at local level. And this is partly, a continuity, but partly also the problem and the challenge that faces all these governments. And democratizing governments like that in Tunisia, where most of the politics is happening back in the capital again. The ability of people in parliament in Tunis, or in government in Tunis, left and right, secular and Islamist, to change reality on the ground in Sidi Bouzid or in Gafsa and where else in the south of the country. There is a huge gap between the two. So the social contract already has been in decay in many ways. The ability of these central governments to actually implement big policies down at local level was very diverse. But the point I really want to make, in fact, is that it seems to me, and I apologize to the translators that I didn't actually write this out, so they'll have to, I'll speak slowly, is that these regimes, at least in Egypt and Syria, Iraq is a slightly different case, but probably the same ultimately, don't actually want to rebuild the old social contract. They are building a new social contract for various reasons. And I may be sort of doing a bit of brutality, violence to, nuance, but in a simplified way. If we look at Egypt, for instance, look at all the big construction projects, the big housing projects, how much has gone into building what are, in effect, gated communities? Upper middle class, new middle class villas, huge areas, which look like Hollywood, New Cairo, where the American University of Cairo sits. You drive for kilometers, you think you're in Southern California. Beautiful villas, sort of, Hispanic, Mexican, or American, mock Mexican style of Southern California, green lawns, palm trees, swimming pools, wide, beautiful avenues, shopping malls. It's not Egypt. And this is replicated. And these areas not only have the rich business people, they also have the ministers and the children of ministers, the children of judges. They have the senior officers and their children. I talked to many Egyptians from my research who would say, well, in my street in Mohandisin, or the nice neighborhoods of Cairo, I had a general and a colonel and so on. They were my neighbors. Or my uncle is a general or something and lived here or there. They're all gone. They've all disappeared into segregated officer villas. They now send their children to a new generation of international schools, which are far too expensive for most people, but where they get subsidized tuition fees for their children. And these are in remote areas. So the upper class in Egypt is relocating outside of dirty, noisy, congested, traffic jam Cairo and moving to the new capital, New Cairo. And there's another new something that's being built somewhere, New Heliopolis, or I forget what. And these are, you should see the drawings for them. These are the imaginations of people who are teaching their children in schools where they speak English. They follow American high school curricula. They don't follow the Egyptian national curriculum anymore, while defending nationalism, of course. This is a social caste that's separate from the rest of Egypt. Syria is not doing exactly the same, but you look at the new laws that have been passed from 2012 to do with land, ownership and use, in which the government has authorized and legalized the destruction of informal housing, which occupies massive areas in Syria, and has allowed things like public-private partnerships, which now have the right to bid and gain property rights to formerly state-owned land to launch high-value real estate projects. This is a new Syria these people imagine. They aren't just going to go back and try and suppress unhappy Sunnis or unhappy Alawis who say, we died for you, now why is it that your cousin gets the big contracts and we still live in poverty? What is imagined for the new Syria doesn't look like that. If you follow what the government has been legislating and decreeing in the economy, in ownership, in land laws, and so on. And even in Iraq, of course, it's a far more complex picture there. But if you look at the pattern of poverty and unemployment in Iraq, areas that are serviced, areas that are not serviced, it may be that who is on top is no longer primarily Sunni Takriti. It may be a Shia from somewhere else. But the deepest poverty in Iraq is the 3 Shia provinces immediately south of Baghdad, where poverty in rural areas is 70%, where marginalization in the social, economic, political sense is deepest. So we still have the haves and the have-nots. And a large part of government spending, not large enough maybe, goes into social welfare schemes that are directed at a lot of these people. We have at least 3 million people, 10% of the population, who live directly off social welfare handouts. Now, you could say, well, that's a socially progressive thing, but we're saying this is actually a substitute for progressive social and economic policies or investment or transformation of economic laws that would allow genuine participation in the marketplace. And I'm going to jump back to Egypt for one last detail there, and then I'll wrap up with a sentence or two. In Egypt, as in Syria, incidentally, prior to the transition or the crisis or 2011, the private sector was actually huge. The Syrian private sector already accounted for more of the economy than the public sector in Syria in the 1990s. There's a very strange system, what Volker Perthes, who's certainly one of the best analysts on Syria and certainly on political economy of Syria in the 1990s, called a bifurcated economy. An economy that's sort of split into 2 zones, each with its own rules and laws, official laws and rules, allowing the private sector to dominate in transport or textiles and parts of trade, but still protecting the public sector. Egypt did something quite different, but both ended up with huge private sectors. In Egypt, however, almost all the wealth of the private sector is concentrated in the top 1% of companies. 98% of Egyptian companies are small businesses or small enterprises, and 1% are what are called, I think, micro businesses. We're talking, in other words, about one person like me sitting on a corner selling tea as a business. 99% of the Egyptian private sector is that size. I mean, maximum 2 or 3 people. I don't know if the 1% are maybe 10 people. All the medium and big enterprises in Egypt form 1% of the private sector. There's something hugely problematic about an economy structured like that. It means that the 99% of the private sector know that even if they have a bright idea or develop a technological innovation or a marketing innovation or come up with something clever, that's not what gets contracts. That's not what gets market access. It's still, after everything that's happened in Egypt, is about being close to someone who's close to someone in power. So how on earth Egypt is going to either build a new social contract or restore real economic growth when it's unable to unlock the private sector is your guess as well as mine. So to finish, I'll simply ask a question. Is it useful to go back to the term rent? Should we maybe think of this as the end of rentierism? These people are trying to rebuild rent, or are they? I mean, if they've run out of capital to co-opt social constituencies, and they no longer know how to generate capital without transforming their economies. But they don't want to do that because then they lose power, and the cronies who've benefited from the new semi-privatized, semi-liberalized system suffer. They lose their vested interest. So there's no real economic transformation. So we still stay stuck with rentier behavior when it comes to helping the big partners in power. But the social contract is eroding, so rentier politics and rentier economics no longer help the rest of society, including the middle classes. So is this then an end of rentierism? Is that how we should think about it? And in that case, we should anticipate, of course, that everything will change. Because everything was built, formed, shaped, and reshaped for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, whether it's Yemen or Libya or Egypt or Algeria or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, Kuwait, Algeria, maybe not so much Morocco, but Jordan certainly. Lebanon, I don't know if I've missed any countries out. Palestine, a non-sovereign state, totally fits the pattern of rentier politics, rentier economics. Most people in these countries have never known a different system, politically, economically, socially. Judges, courts, businessmen, educators, schools, priests, and imams, they've all known nothing but operating within these systems. So when these systems start to fall apart or to deliberately maybe dismantle themselves, as we maybe are seeing in some of these places, everything else is going to have to adapt and change and reposition. What is going to come out of that? And I'm going to stop there. Sorry if I've taken a bit too long.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Just a tiny bit too long, but I think
I'm sorry.
Your train of thought was unstoppable, and thank you very much for such an insightful talk and all these the points you've raised that definitely take political as well as economic factors. I have 2 or 3 questions for you, and then we'll give way to the public. You were talking about some of these countries, such as Morocco or Jordan, that managed to sort of like quickly maneuver towards reforms that managed to sort of like keep the order stable. You also talked about timing, how very important is timing, and in that sense, how Algeria was in a way, well placed at the time to. Of course, there was a bloody civil war, but it meant that it was also able to accommodate somehow power sharing. I was wondering if the recent, the 2011 uprisings were much more difficult to manage for countries such as Egypt or Yemen or Syria, because of also the new power of communication, social media, besides the fact that obviously, prices of oil were different, but oil prices. But how important is for you the role of communication, social media in general, or smartphones, or to keep the masses silent or quiet?
I think it's a very good question. My view, I'm not being old-fashioned here, but social media played a role, but ultimately they played a role the way, the radio played a role previously, or, the Kalashnikov did. New technologies are used by everyone, and now, of course, we see how they're used by everyone, including by authoritarian structures, by ISIS, which confirms that they don't have only a disruptive or revolutionary or progressive or democratic use. at that moment, they were very powerful, and here's where I think I agree with the implication of your question. They transmitted images with a force and a power and an immediacy that was I think, quite decisive in a way. Let me put it slightly differently, that think back to the French Revolution, and here I'm borrowing from the British historian Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote a wonderful history of that era, the age of revolutions. His argument was there were two revolutions. There was the political revolution, which was the French Revolution, and an industrial revolution, an economic one. On the politics, he said there was one successful revolution in France, and then 50 years of counter-revolution. So France, the idea of France, even though it took 2 months for people to hear about it, or 6 months, it still reached people who were ready for various reasons to pick up the slogans, the ideas, and challenge their own aristocrats in Poland or in Britain or elsewhere. But it's only in France that it succeeded, because the aristocrats or new kinds of authoritarian leaders in these countries learned the lessons and either repressed extremely violently or accommodated and co-opted cleverly. That happened again, Hobsbawm also argues in his next book, after the Paris Commune, after 48 and then 70, 71 in Paris, that Bismarck was someone who understood that the liberal bourgeois values of democracy and the vote, which he didn't like, had to be accommodated, and he actually took them over, started his own political party, and called it the Liberal Party, and then basically took all the liberalism out of it, and took Germany, in a new direction. My point being that the social media, in a way, excited everyone outside of Tunisia and Egypt, where the revolution first happened. And by the time it came to Libya, only weeks later, or Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, things were already shifting. And it wasn't inevitable that Libya would go where it went. Gaddafi nearly won, had NATO not intervened at that moment. Ali Abdullah Saleh might have gone completely had the GCC countries not left him a loophole in the peace accord. We could say the same of every one of them. What we do know, however, is that the history of this, since the early victories of Tunisia and Egypt, of the social media, if you like, everything else since then has been the counter action, whether of Saudi Arabia and what it has been doing in its funding, in its very strong political lobbying against anything that's new, anything that was revolutionary. Their commitment in Egypt, their commitment in most other places has been on the other side. So my view is that, yes, social media had that initial impact in getting the idea, the image across very quickly, but that is about the end of it. Because since then, we've got a different political story, a different political history. Mm-hmm. Unfolding, still unfolding, and we're still in the first part of it.
Mm-hmm. I have a question on the new social contract. I found it very interesting, the fact that you analyze or take into account this shift in values of the elites that want to emulate American lifestyles and go to new neighborhoods. And I was wondering if in this new social contract there is I don't know if it involves psychology, but the fact is that the military elite, although it knows that it has to strike political deals with, as you were saying, social actors and political partners, decide not to include them, but to exclude them from the cake share, despite knowing that this will play against them. So what is happening in the sort of like military elite psyche? Is it just that they don't have the vision, or that they are in defensive mode and they can't see the utility of the old social contract?
That's a more difficult question to answer because, first of all, I don't think it's military elites in every case. Only in Egypt are the armed forces truly a central actor. And even there, we're not entirely sure about sentiment within the armed forces, and especially as you go lower down from the major generals to the slightly middle ranks. And in Syria, I don't think the army are in a controlling position. The regime needs them, without which it can't survive. But without the regime, the army doesn't survive either. And in Syria, as in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, it was always the president and the sort of the regime in the sense of a political network who truly controlled things. No general, no commander of the army was ever able to defy the president. And we have the case of several defense ministers and army commanders or popular generals in Iraq from the Iran war who died in helicopter accidents or ultimately were killed, as in with Hussein, the son-in-law of Saddam, who was involved, charged with chemical warfare. So it's only Egypt where it's a military elite question. And there what we see is that whether it's the army, the interior ministry, the judges, Sisi himself, they are clearly not favoring big businessmen. And whether this is the old big businessmen who were close to Hosni Mubarak, the cronies like Ahmed Izz and Mohammed Abu al-Ainain and Mohammed Haikal, or new big businessmen, or the people in between, let's say Sawiris and Mansour and some of these others who are more independent. In fact, I mean, it's clear that they give them some contracts, but they're also giving a lot more now to companies we've not heard of before. So more medium or other big businesses. So something is happening there. They're looking for partners, but they don't allow any of these partners any significant say in economic policy. These people are grateful if they get the contract. That's it. They don't think for a moment to influence policy. Sawiris once or twice back in 2011 made some complaints in front of TV about, we can't put a mobile telephone mast anywhere without the permission of the Air Force. He made a complaint that when the army goes into business, everything is easy. Hard currency is easy, free customs, no duties, the rules, the laws, everything they know how to navigate. For us, if only it was like that. He says things like this. But bottom line is, that doesn't mean he actually shapes or influences policy. In Syria, too, if you look at the regime, at the end of the day, in the middle of the war, I'm told anecdotal evidence by people who go to Damascus and come back, that the signs of wealth are even more obvious than ever in terms of the sort of cars some people drive, the investments they can make. So a certain sector in the war, because of the war, has been able to get crony contracts more than before, not less. Rami Makhlouf and Hazim, is it Makhlouf or I forget now who, his brother and cousin, all the sort of family, cousins and friends and so on, and Hamsho and these other big businessmen who work for the regime, they've become richer than ever before. Partly because when the Iranians gave, say, a credit line to the regime, which means they'd say, here is $1 billion worth of credit for your merchants or traders to purchase goods from Iran, which is, what standard practice in trade. Who got the credit? The same people. So whenever money came in, it went back to the same people. At a time when you would have thought, I used to think that the regime would favor maybe the Alawi community generally with salary bonuses, with pensions for martyrs and widows of martyrs and so on, instead of which they simply played with the foreign currency market, and the weaker the Syrian pound got, so the Syrian pound, let's say, lost 300% of its value, and then they happily announced 20% increase of salary to soldiers. But of course, the value of the increase was now worth about $2 a month or something, etc. So in most of these cases, and Iraq is more complex, partly because we don't have a big private sector outside of contractors working directly for the government. But in Syria, where historically there is an important private sector, the crony features of this private sector have become stronger because anyone who wasn't a crony has either left the country or has had to accept that they have small contracts. Anyone who stayed in Syria as a businessman has had to pay protection money to the regime in one form or the other in order to stay in business, to at least on a big scale. Anyone else had to downscale and become very small or move elsewhere. And the regime probably understands that many of these people won't come back in a hurry, and therefore is no longer even looking at them. And when it's been freeing up the opportunities for private investment in land, clearing informal housing, in the heart of Damascus, areas that were prime real estate, going back about 3 years ago already, 3.5 years ago, May 2013, I think, a law passed, and I asked Syrian economists about it, and they hadn't even paid attention. I said, why now is the regime passing laws in government to make it easier for government to allow use of state land by private owners? Already they were laying the stage for new kinds of business partners. But these aren't going to be a business class that is autonomous and powerful on its own. This is a business class that is already part of the network. They're cronies, and they either accept that or they're out, if they're not already part of the same regime itself, like the cousins and others. So that's my sense, that partnerships are going to be totally transformed. Iraq, we may not see the process clearly because, frankly, I think Iraq is going back into war next. Never mind Mosul, never mind ISIS. The real danger in Iraq is the day after Mosul, because the Iraqi state has not been fixed. All the problems of the Iraqi state are still there. The next fights are going to be in between Sunnis. The worst fight is going to be between Shia forces. I think the next battle of Iraq is in Baghdad. Maybe not militarily, I hope not, because it'll be much worse than anything we've seen. But we, I think, have a lot more conflict in Iraq to see before we get to talking about a new political economy of Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we're gonna take some questions. Vamos a pedir a tomar preguntas del público. Como dijo el profesor Sayed, aquí tenéis tarjetas.
And as Professor Sayed has said, you have the cards here, business cards, if you want to get in touch with him directly, and also to remind you to visit the website of Carnegie Middle East Center so that you can read the articles that he's mentioned. And thank you very much for your presence, and a round of applause.